Hi, before we get to Ovid and his amazing metamorphoses, I feel like I really should talk about Plato. So I'm going to spend one session talking about Plato, but I want to encourage you to be reading Ovid and his marvelous metamorphoses. I'm only asking you to read books 1 through 5, and I would like you to read book 9. So I'm not asking you to read the whole thing. I'll tell you that I'm going to spend most of my attention on books 4 and book 9, maybe a little bit of 4 and 5, but just delightful stories. But I feel obligated before we leap into the Roman era to talk about Plato and something that I think is hands down perhaps the most important philosophical idea that's going to shape the Western world, including Christianity. And even to the point where I would argue that you can't really fully grasp the New Testament and what they're attempting to do and how they're attempting to do it without an understanding of Plato and his idea of reality. In one of his dialogues, maybe his greatest dialogue, called The Republic, which is a very long series of dialogues in which Plato discusses his ideal state. His ideal state is not my ideal state for sure. It's more like a totalitarian state that's ruled by philosophers. But one of the most interesting ideas he has in this is his idea of reality and what is real. No matter what you think of Plato, you have to acknowledge that this idea, and that word is an interesting one, which we'll talk about, this idea may be the single most influential idea on the Western world next to the monotheism of Judaism and Christianity. And trying to explain his idea of reality, he told a parable called the parable of the cave. And I've given you a copy of it, and it's in the materials, it's in your syllabus, but I'm also going to post it here in this session. But let's talk about this for a moment and what makes it so interesting. Now, the real question he's dealing with is reality, and how do we know what is real? Now, if I look at a chair, how do I know that's a chair? What is it that makes that a chair? Well, let's address that. But first of all, I need to say that Plato, who lived at the same time as Sophocles, he would have been a contemporary, may have even seen Oedipus. He would certainly probably would have known Sophocles. He would have known some of the other great playwrights, such as Aristophanes. He is a student of the great Socrates, and then Plato's star student, Aristotle, also became quite influential, to say the least. Now, here's a couple things I have to say about Plato, and that is that he's almost synonymous with philosophy when we talk about Plato. And some of his ideas we certainly maybe reject, but he's kind of like Freud. So much of what he said has been influential that we forget that, and we're often left with some of his wackier ideas. But one of his more influential ideas is certainly his idea of what is real. So let's go back to the chair. How do we know a chair is a chair, and what is it that makes it real? So, because for example, I mean, certainly you look at that and you know it's a chair. When my son was 3 years old, he could have walked in, he would have looked at that, and he would have said, it's a chair. What is it that makes that a chair? Is it the fact that it has 4 legs? Well, that can't be it, because I've seen some chairs that have no legs. Is it the fact that it has a back? But no, I've seen many chairs that have no back, like a stool. Is it the fact that you sit on it? Is it its function? Well, Plato argues that how we know that that is a chair is that there is this chair, but it is just the shadow of the real chair, the idea of the chair. As a matter of fact, he would put it this way. Imagine for a moment that you are in a room alone with that chair. And he might ask, there are two, or he might first say, there are two chairs in this room. This one right here, this wooden chair that I've just showed you, and this one, the idea of the chair. This is a word actually he invents, idea of the chair. He's going to argue that the real chair is not the physical chair that you sit on, but rather the real chair is the idea of the chair. And proof of that is I can leave that chair in the room alone for 1,000,000 years and it will never produce more chairs. However, the idea of a chair that I have right here, I could not only make as many chairs as I want, I could modify the chair. I could create a couch, I could create a love seat, I could create a bar stool. I could create all kinds of varieties. I could create a chair that's uniquely mine, because this is the real chair, because it has the ability, I have the ability to take that idea and to create from it. This is a significant idea, no pun intended, is he's going to argue that we can run with this. How do we know, for example, that you and I are real? Are we real? He would say that we are shadows and something had the idea of us. We could, go, for example, the computer you're using. Is that a real computer, or is that a shadow of the idea someone had? The room you're in, is that a real room, or is that the shadow of some design that an architect had? Your house. We could just keep going and going into the world. How do we know the world is real? He would say the world is a shadow because there's this ultimate mind that had the idea of it. Now, he could carry this all the way to the universe. Is the universe real? Well, if you follow his logic, he would say the universe itself must be a shadow of an idea. So therefore, there must be some ultimate mind that has the idea of the universe. Now, he's never going to go so far as to call it God. Instead, he's going to call it the Logos, or the Word. So this ultimate imagination that has imagined and thought of everything. The Logos. That's where everything is real, right here. Now, he's trying to explain this because this is a difficult concept for sure. He tells this interesting story called The Parable of the Cave. And so I'm going to see if I can explain it for you right here. He says, imagine, if you will, that the vast majority of us from birth have been chained down at the bottom of a cave. This is us right here. We're chained here. We can see the wall here in front of us, but we can't even turn our heads because there's something around our necks that keeps us from turning. We're aware of the people around us, but we can't see them really. Behind us, there's a fire. And so because there's a fire, there's shadows on the wall, people are moving back and forth behind this wall. And I also get some diffused sunlight through here. And I have no idea what's behind me because I can't see it. All I can see are the shadows on the wall. Plato will argue that if all you've ever seen is shadows, if all you've ever seen is the shadow of the things behind you, then you are naturally going to believe that it's the shadows that are real. So if I were to stand behind you and I were to have a cup, and I would hold the cup up and you were to see the shadow of the cup, you would think there's a cup. But if I were to hold the cup out in front of you, so you suddenly now you see the real cup and the shadow, you would still think that that shadow was the real one. I'm not sure what we would think that the cup was. He says that's what it's like for us, that we have come to this point where we actually think that the shadow of reality is the thing that's real, because that's all we see, that's all we dare to contemplate, not thinking about the idea of where are these things coming from, who is creating them, what makes them. So we become content with this. He takes great digs at college professors and colleges, saying that while we're down here, we began to, notice patterns in the shadows, and we began to uh, give degrees out to people, college degrees, for people who've identified different kinds of patterns in the shadows. Now, the people who are back behind here, these are what Plato will call philosophers, because a philosopher is somebody who is aware, who's thought about this, that is aware that there's more to the world than I can just see. That's a philosopher. And they feel sorry for us, the vast majority of us. And so they might actually make puppet shows for us, little fun puppet shows, with the shadows up here to entertain us, to keep us occupied. Now, what would happen if one of us should happen to, let's say this person right here decides, I have a sense that there's more to the world than I can see. And let's say this person decides to break the chains, discovered that those chains actually break very easily, and she stands up and looks behind her. What will she see? Well, Plato says at first it's going to be entirely blinding, because looking right at the light is going to be a shock. And he says truth is like that. The first time you encounter it, it's always disorienting, it's blinding. But after a while, your eyes adjust and you begin to say, hey, there's something back here. And you start to describe it to your friends here, but they, of course, think you're crazy. And he says that's often how it seems to somebody who has seen a bigger reality. When you try to explain it to those who cannot see it or are unwilling to see it, they think maybe you're a little crazy. So let's say this person decides actually even to walk up and out of the cave, or go out of the cave, stepping outside the cave. Of course, there's sunshine up above, trees, but at first it's just going to be blinding to her. So because truth is blinding when you first encounter it, but given time, her eyes will adjust, and then she'll see these remarkable things out there. And of course, she's going to want to go tell her friends about it. So she runs down, hey, everybody, you're not going to believe what I've seen. I've seen such wonders. I have seen actually what's really behind everything, that we've just been seeing shadows. Well, what are these people going to think? They're going to think she's crazy. We might, I don't know, kill her, because that's what we often do to prophets, to geniuses, people who see things that are beyond our comprehension at first. Is it ever possible for her to come back here and just be somebody down at the end of the cave? No, she can never go back. Once you have encountered a truth, there's no going back. And that is an interesting idea of the reality, if you will. Here's a better picture so I can get kind of closer here. You can see he would argue in some ways that that's exactly what our world is like. Is we are full of people, the vast majority of people, content to simply look at shadows and see them as a kind of reality. And even if, as people make puppet shows for us, we're content with that, with these little stories that are made for us, and rarely curious enough to say, where does this come from? There must be more to the world than I can see. Because very few people are called to or even capable of being philosophers, he would argue. I would personally say that we are all called to be a kind of philosopher, but most of us feel comfortable with the shadows. I think the comfort is the biggest threat to us. And when I think about that, I think about, are we there right now? I like this color picture here much better here. Here we are looking at the shadows, and here are some people making puppet shows. But here are some philosophers over here, and they're looking out and they see and they explore, and they're so not content with just what's being shown to them on the screen, if you will, of the back of the cave. Instead, we're more like this, content, believing that what we see on our television screens and the movie screens and on our phones and computers, that's what is real. And we can tell that that's what we think is real because that's about the only thing we really talk about and think about. And when we're called on to think about larger issues. Oh, that frustrates us. We feel just comfortable. Just give me my sitcoms, give me my movies, give me my computer where I can watch YouTube, and don't bother me with reality. Don't bother me with ideas that are bigger than me. And it's easy for us to see also why Christians loved this metaphor. Because isn't that really what Christianity is? Isn't that what Jesus is doing? He's saying there's more than you can see. Eyes have not seen and ears have not heard. That there is a reality beyond what you've seen before. That's really the call of Christianity, is to call people out of the doldrums of just the shadow. So when the early Christians were writing the New Testament, Plato's ideas of reality were not just fringe ideas. They had been accepted as dominant ideas. And it affected their writing. Now, one thing I will notice, let me explain a little bit of how it can come about and how it can affect things. So many of the things that we've been looking at, like Homer and Ovid, which you're reading now, but also Plato and Aristotle, well, these were dominant ideas and figures in the time of the first century. A lot of these figures became lost, and a lot of their works became lost as we went into the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. Knowledge actually began to significantly decrease along with lifespans and technology. And these texts became lost. Well, we call those the Dark Ages, which is not fair, but we call it that because there definitely was a slowing down of information and knowledge. And it is not the church's fault, as some scholars want to do. Really, I would argue it was the breakdown of the Roman Empire that caused this. But notice these two pictures of the Nativity. One is this one over here to your left, is a very typical nativity scene from the medieval period. It's actually from 1150 AD, from an anonymous painter of some sort. And you'll notice a couple of things that are similar about it. One is that there's no real dimensions. You don't have a 3D sort of a dimension. Mary looks like, she must be 12 feet tall compared to other people. She's even enormous compared to Joseph over here. The baby Jesus, that's the biggest baby I've ever seen. And both of them are enormous compared to other people in the picture. Is that because the artists back then didn't know how to paint? No, it's because their efforts were of a different sort. They're actually trying to illustrate significance. And so Mary is the most significant, and Jesus are the most significant figures in this painting, so they'll be the biggest. Well, in about 1400 AD, the texts that we've been looking at in this class became rediscovered, and they began to be translated into Latin for educated people. And people like Plato and his ideas of reality, Homer and his Odyssey and Iliad, uh, Oedipus, the king, and the plays by Sophocles, all of these things began to be read. And the idea of the reality begins to take shape. So that rather than a reality being a fixed form like we have in the Dark Ages, reality becomes in the mind of the artist. Therefore, the artist has the freedom to portray these ideas in a way that he or she sees fit. We begin to see the genius of creativity again. And so here you see this beautiful Caravaggio is looking more real. The figures, look quite real. They are all the right size. And it certainly has a distinctive style of Caravaggio. Even if his name weren't on it, we would know this is a Caravaggio. And then looking at these two, these are two of my favorite nativity scenes. To your left is a Rembrandt. And notice, if you will, even though this is almost the same time as the Caravaggio, that the style is so drastically different. And that's because Rembrandt, like Caravaggio, are depicting these stories, or this story, in a way that that fits their personality, that fits their vision, their idea. So the idea of what is real becomes something that allows for creativity. This is my very favorite nativity picture from Van Onhurst. I love all the Dutch painters so much. It's realistic, it's beautiful. Mary is beautiful. I've often wondered why Jesus is glowing in these pictures, but it does make for astonishing images. All of these take place because they are moved by Plato's idea of reality. This is going to also have an explosion of music that is creative, and art and sculpture. It's going to have medicine, because suddenly now the onus is on the human brain to come up with ideas, not merely to be copyists of what's already been made. So it comes back to this, where artists no longer see themselves as staring at shadows and then they're going to make copies of what they see, but they now imagine themselves as explorers of ideas, and they could go and find what's real. Now, when John was writing his marvelous gospel, he uses the language of Plato, and of course he's writing to a very Hellenized audience, a Greek-ized audience. He opens in maybe one of the most beautiful passages in Scripture. He says, "In the beginning was the Word." Now that word, the word, in the Greek is actually the same word that Plato uses, the logos. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. So remember, for Plato, the logos is this ultimate imagination that imagined everything, that had the idea of everything. So knowing that, what John's actually saying here is very radical. He's saying, in the beginning was this ultimate imagination that you are all aware of, called the Logos. And this ultimate imagination was with God. And not only that, this ultimate imagination that you've heard about was God. And he was with God in the beginning. And through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. All through the New Testament, we see this sort of Platonic way of talking. For example, perhaps the most Platonic author is the author of Hebrews, where he will say things that we take for granted, but they're essentially using Plato's idea, where he would say something like, the lamb that we sacrificed was not the real lamb. It was a shadow of the real lamb, who was Christ. And the high priest was never the real high priest. He was just a shadow of the real one, who was Christ. And the tabernacle that the Israelites had out in the wilderness was not the real one. It was just a shadow of the real one that's in heaven. We're used to talking like this. We don't think about what an extraordinary philosophical leap this is. This is going to shape everything that we read from here on out, including Ovid. Ovid is going to take great license in remaking these myths in his image. And he's going to do so in part because, thanks to Plato and his idea of reality, he's not a mere copyist. He's not just writing down these myths as he heard them. He's using the creativity and ingenuity of an artist and poet as he writes, because the true reality is not the story, but my idea of the story. And so I have some license. This is an incredibly important idea, and one that Christians have embraced heartily. As a matter of fact, there will be a new movement, which we won't talk about in this class, called the Neoplatonists, which were Christians who essentially took Plato's idea and turned it into a philosophical way of thinking. And I'm very fond of the Neoplatonists, not so much always Plato, but the Neoplatonists. If any of you have ever seen the film The Matrix with Keanu Reeves, that is nothing more than a science fiction retelling of Plato's Parable of the Cave, where instead of being chained at the bottom of a cave, it's something a little more sophisticated, where we as humans are linked into kind of a system where we're dreaming of what we see. Well, Plato would agree. Plato would agree. So I have a question for you. I want you to think about that. Are you comfortable with shadows, or do you ever ask yourself, is there more? Is there more to the world that I see, or do I accept what I see as real? Do I have the courage to explore and find out what is real in the world? Anyway, I have a question. I hope you found that kind of interesting. And I've added a little more here, and that I hope you'll take a look at. And I look forward to hearing the discussion. Hey, thank you so much.